Here's what's coming up on The World Today. The United States says U.S. citizens should leave Ukraine immediately due to increased threats of Russian invasion. NATO warns of real risk for new war in Europe. Plus, death toll from Cyclone Valentine rises to 111 in Madagascar. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Teniola Shobowale. We begin with Ukraine. U.S. President Joe Biden has called on all American citizens remaining there to leave the country immediately, citing increased threats of Russian military action. Mr. Biden says he would not send troops to rescue Americans if Moscow invades Ukraine. He warns that things could go crazy quickly in the region. Russia has repeatedly denied any plans to invade Ukraine, despite amassing more than 100,000 troops near the border. But it has just begun massive military drills with neighboring Belarus, and Ukraine has accused Russia of blocking its access to the sea. Kremlin says it wants to enforce red lines to make sure that its former Soviet neighbor does not join NATO. Reiterating that warning by the U.S. President, Secretary of State Antony Blinken says Russia has sent more forces to its border with Ukraine and could launch an invasion at any time, including during the Winter Olympics. He says Washington is continuing to draw down its embassy in the country. He made the comment after meeting Quad foreign leaders in Melbourne, Australia.
Simply put, we continue to see very troubling signs of Russian escalation, including new forces arriving at the Ukrainian border. And as we said before, we're in a window when an invasion could begin at any time. And to be clear, that includes during the Olympics. We're continuing to draw down our embassy. We will continue that process. And we've also been very clear that any American citizens who remain in Ukraine should leave now, pursuing a dual-track approach to the challenge posed by Russia and the forces that it's massed, unprovoked, along Ukraine's borders. Diplomacy and dialogue. We would strongly prefer to resolve the differences that we have through diplomacy, through dialogue. That is the responsible way to do things. We've made every possible effort to engage Russia, to look at the concerns that it's raised, to share concerns that we have, that European partners and allies have, to see if we can't find ways to advance collective security on a reciprocal basis.
Well, NATO has also raised the alarm over the Ukraine crisis, warning of a real risk for a new armed conflict in Europe and promises to reinforce its eastern flank. Speaking from an airbase in Romania, where the United States has temporarily deployed soldiers, NATO Chief Jens Stoltenberg says Washington-led alliance would consider maintaining a longer-term presence in Eastern Europe in the coming months.
We continue to reinforce our eastern flank with more ships, with more planes, with more troops. And we are also ready to quickly reinforce if needed. We have increased the readiness of the NATO response force, and we can deploy more forces on short notice if needed. So that is what we have done already. Deployed more troops and increased readiness so we can reinforce quickly. For instance, the United States has announced that they have assigned 8,500 extra troops to the NATO response force so they can be easily and quickly deployed. Then we are, on top of that, we are also assessing whether we should adjust our more longer-term presence in the eastern part of the alliance. And that includes a battle group in Romania, but also perhaps battle groups in other parts of the southeast of the alliance. The presence of US troops at this base in Romania sends a very strong message of US, North American commitment to European security. So therefore it was great to meet the US troops today from the Striker Brigade to talk to them, and they are professional, they are committed, and I'm extremely grateful for the service of all the US servicemen here in Romania.
Meanwhile, the British Defence Minister Ben Wallace has told his Russian counterpart, Sergei Shoigu, he hopes they could use their meeting in Moscow to resolve a number of issues through diplomacy. Before flying to Moscow, Mr. Wallace confirmed the UK was providing more defensive equipment, including body armour, helmets and combat boots, to the Ukrainian government. He also said it was important to show NATO countries won't let threats push us around. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson had said on Thursday that Europe faces its biggest security crisis in decades amid detentions.
So to lay the wreath today was important also for me as a former soldier. I have buried too many soldiers in my time. I don't want to see any other soldiers from any side have to be buried. I don't want to see any conflict in our Europe. And as I have said, we already have too many threats from extremist Islamist terrorism and other causes. And so I hope that by speaking today and starting that relationship that was at 0%, that we can resolve a number of the issues that you have raised, that we can address some of the issues raised in Russia's draft treaty that was sent in December to us, and we can try and move on to where we can resolve our issues together through diplomacy, through other actions, and through confidence-building measures.
And away from the Ukraine conflict, the UK Home Secretary Priti Patel says the new Metropolitan Police Commissioner must tackle police culture and conduct. The Home Secretary says strong and decisive new leadership will be required to restore public confidence. Dame Cressida Dick said she had been left with no choice but to resign after London's mayor made it clear to her he had no confidence in her leadership. It follows cases of sexism and misogyny among some Met officers. Last week, the police watchdog found disgraceful examples of bullying and sexual harassment at Charing Cross Police Station in central London. Our correspondent in London, Juliana Olanka, joins us now for more on this story. Juliana, Dame Cressida was the first woman to lead the biggest UK police force, but recently she also faced a lot of criticism. Speak to us about how we got to this point of her resignation.
Yeah, good evening, Tenny. I think the timing may have been off, but it's hardly surprising that Cressida Dick handed in her resignation yesterday, especially given the music that was coming out of City Hall over the past couple of weeks. As you rightly said, there was an independent report released last week showing a litany of really bad, disgraceful behaviour in the heart of the police force in London. Racism, misogyny, bullying. On top of that, there have been a series of really public incidents that have made people lose their confidence in Cressida Dick. I'm sure many of you may remember about Sarah Everard, a young lady who was killed by a police officer, Wayne Couzens, during a vigil. The behaviour from the police to the people that had come to pay their respects was considered as shocking. Government ministers had to apologise. If we go back 15 years earlier, when Cressida was in charge of the terrorism police organisation, Jean-Charles de Menezes, a young Brazilian man, was killed dead, mistakenly confused as a terrorist. And there are several other issues recently that look at the behaviour of some police members across the country. I think with Cressida Dick, yes, she was the First Lady to head the organisation. Yes, she also had a really good record of reducing violent crime, and that is an important metric when you're looking at policing in any big city. But she seemed to be very sympathetic to police officers. There was no tough love, and she often described some of these major incidents as one-offs, or some terms she said a bad un meaning one, when actually it's the whole culture of the Metropolitan Police that needs to change.
And Juliana, what's been the political reaction to her departure? I know there's been some back and forth with the London mayor in the past.
Well, there's been a mixed reaction. Again, I think, the resignation was inevitable, but the timing is wrong. We know that Downing Street and the Prime Minister is caught up in a police investigation at the moment. There were some allegations previously that perhaps Cressida Dick had tried to muzzle the report that was coming out about the Downing Street parties. But then, of course, if she was very friendly with the Prime Minister, then there are some senior ministers, including the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, that were fond of her. And so I think, it's going to be very, very tough for the new commissioner. They've got to play a very tight political game in the sense of how it's going to be handling this investigation into the Downing Street parties. But there are a lot of serious issues affecting the British public at the moment, including the high cost of living. So this is just one, other extra thing that is on the Prime Minister's email list.
And I mean, amid all these issues, like you rightly mentioned, another person also facing pressure to resign is the Prime Minister. Does this change in the police leadership change anything regarding the police investigation in terms of the timing, that investigation into the parties at Downing Street?
Well, it shouldn't, but inevitably it will. There was a really interesting report in the Evening Standard a couple of hours ago about some senior ministers having to be warned not to pressure Scotland Yard. They don't want the Prime Minister having any special treatment. Of course, he's the Prime Minister. What do you do when you've got him speaking to you under caution? There are concerns there. But, the Prime Minister is going full steam ahead. Apparently, he's hired a COVID-19 regulations expert to get him to legally find his way out of this political storm. Of course, he lives and works in Number 10, which means that, it would be difficult for him to avoid a party if it's in his office, in his house. But there are other parties. There was also a scathing attack launched by the former Conservative Prime Minister, Sir John Major, who is an arch rival of Boris Johnson. But of course, this is another issue that has to be faced. But there are concerns that, the Downing Street bubble could put pressure on Scotland Yard, but we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah, so when can we expect a new UK police chief to be announced? And are there any names floating about? What are you hearing?
No names floating about at the moment. It's generally just complete shock and reaction to what's happened with Cressida Dick. It is half-term holidays here in the UK, so Parliament is on recess. No word yet from Sadiq Khan, the Mayor of London, that will have a really a huge say in who is going to be in charge of the police. And of course, he is for the Labour Party. And the Home Secretary is a Conservative, and they don't necessarily see eye to eye on all matters. So, yes, we'll just have to wait and see. And as soon as I've got that, I'll give it to you, Tenny.
All right, then, Juliana, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And away from the UK, at least 111 people in Madagascar are now known to have died since Cyclone Batsirai hit the Indian Ocean island nearly a week ago. According to the National Emergency Agency, many homes simply crumpled in the ferocious winds, leaving around 30,000 people living in emergency shelters. Southern African nations were already reeling from January's tropical storm Anna. Storms are common in this part of the world, but the climate crisis has caused them to become more destructive. It has also worsened drought, which has hit southern Madagascar hard, in turn making the humanitarian response after these storms even more urgent. There's still to come on the program. Valentine's Day is just around the corner, but a London zoo is giving ex-lovers the opportunity to take revenge with a Name a Cockroach scheme. More details in a moment. Please stay with us. Thanks for staying with us. Africa is on track to end the disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic in 2022, almost 2 years after the continent identified its first case. This is according to the World Health Organization Regional Director for Africa, Matshidiso Moeti. However, Ms. Moeti says the pandemic has caused severe damage to social and economic development in the region. According to WHO data, the African continent has witnessed 4 waves of COVID-19 infections over the past 2 years, each with higher peaks or more total new cases than the previous one. With African countries' epidemic prevention and control measures becoming more effective, each wave became shorter, while the death rate has dropped from 2.5% to 0.8%.
The pandemic has taken a brutal toll, with tens of thousands of lives lost and incalculable damage wrought to African economies and communities. The World Bank estimates that the pandemic has pushed up to 40 million people in Africa into poverty. Controlling this pandemic must be a priority if we are also to end the disruption and destruction and begin regaining control over our lives.
A state of emergency has been declared in Canada's Ontario in response to 2 weeks of protest against COVID-19 restrictions. Premier Doug Ford made the call as demonstrations continue to shut down part of Ottawa and Windsor Ambassador's Bridge, a crucial pathway for US-Canada trade. Mr. Ford says the order would make it clear it is illegal to block crucial infrastructure. Protesters could face up to a year in jail and $100,000 in fines. The protests are the latest challenge for the auto sector on both sides of the border, which has already been wrestling with a global shortage of semiconductors along with COVID-19.
In my opinion, the first step is to diffuse the situation by opening up some good communication and dropping these mandates and resetting life back to normal. If everyone here leaves and goes home, and everyone is a little bit happy, and everyone can go back to doing what they want to do, then we can start to have a civilized discussion about things. But until the mandates and the restrictions are lifted, no one here is leaving. This can go on for days, weeks, months, it doesn't matter. And if it's not here, it's going to be somewhere else. So there's not going to be an end to this. The mandates need to go.
I mean, these guys are not going anywhere. So the government can, accept the fact that they took the freedom away from the people and give it back peacefully, and everybody goes home. Everybody's happy. Or you can bring out the riot police, like like they said they would, and it would turn out very ugly.
Well, different opinions there on the streets of Canada to the protest. The VOA's Craig McCulloch joins us now from Vancouver. Craig, thanks so much for joining us on the program. Speak to us about the state of emergency just declared. What does this change?
Well, the state of emergency is in the province of Ontario, which is the most populous province here in Canada. And what it does is it gives the provincial government in Ontario, where the border blockade is on the bridge to Detroit and where Ottawa is our national capital is located, it gives them powers to get resources to go in and do what they think is necessary to remove the blockade and issue fines and in the hundreds of thousands of dollars and up to a year in prison if people do not comply. So it gives the provincial authorities in Ontario more power to do what they want.
And how about other states? Is this likely to deter protesters, first of all, and are other states likely to follow suit?
Well, in Canada, we're made up of 10 provinces and 3 territories. And this entire protest and convoy actually started here in Vancouver back in January. And the trucks started here in Vancouver and went on a caravan or convoy across Canada. And for the last 2 weekends, we have had protests in cities across Canada. We've had kind of like these mini little convoys, trucks and protesters coming in from the suburbs and cities down to the inner cores, the downtown cores of cities across Canada. And many of them are against the COVID restrictions, but they also have a lot of other oppositions, including to the Trudeau government.
Okay, so the United States has urged the Canadian government to use its federal powers to end the blockade. How likely is this to happen?
Well, it's these trucks are huge vehicles, and it takes a lot to tow them. In Ontario, all the municipal towing authorities have said they don't want to go anywhere near it. So the talking right now is bringing in heavy equipment and perhaps contracting American towing companies. And again, these aren't companies that tow cars around Lagos or around Vancouver or New York. These are huge trucks. They're industrial-sized trucks, but bringing in tow trucks from the United States to remove them. This really hit home to a lot of people when the bridge from Detroit to Windsor was actually shut down, because that's caused a lot of auto plants in Ontario, and it's beginning to have an impact on the big auto manufacturers in Detroit, because auto parts and pieces of cars actually go back across the border multiple times before a finished product hits the showroom floor. So that's really getting a lot of attention. There's 2 other border crossings that have been blocked, and there's a protest near a border crossing here in Vancouver. And that Detroit-Windsor border crossing is the busiest in all of Canada, and there's over $2 billion US in trade that goes across that border every day. And the mayor of Windsor, who is also trying to get an injunction against those protesters, say it's about $400 million US in trade that goes across that bridge every day, about 8,000 trucks.
All right, then, Craig, thank you so much for giving us a clearer picture of the situation on ground.
You're welcome.
In the meantime, similar protests like the ones seen in Canada have also erupted in Australia, New Zealand and France. Here's a wrap-up of the latest from around the world on our Global Update.
More people arrived outside New Zealand's parliament earlier today as protesters calling for an end to a vaccine mandate and tough COVID-19 restrictions refused to end their demonstrations despite arrests by the police. It's been 4 days since several thousand protesters, inspired by truckers' demonstrations in Canada, occupied the Parliament lawns in the capital, Wellington, and blocked surrounding streets with their trucks, cars, camper vans and motorcycles. On Thursday, the police arrested 120 people as they attempted to forcefully remove the protesters. And in France, despite an order not to enter Paris, motorists protesting against COVID-19 restrictions are converging on the French capital from multiple cities across France, inspired by the horn-blaring demonstrations taking place in Canada. The motorists' protest follows waves of demonstrations over France's vaccine pass rules, which require people to show proof of inoculation against COVID to enter bars, restaurants, and other public spaces. Officials say France will deploy thousands of police in and around Paris today and over the weekend and set up checkpoints at toll stations on major roads leading into the capital to keep Freedom Convoy motorists out. In developments, Italy's government has lifted an obligation to wear masks outdoors under most circumstances in response to an improving coronavirus situation. Under new rules set by Health Minister Roberto Speranza, from February the 11th until at least March the 31st, it will be necessary to wear protective masks only in crowded areas and at indoor public venues. Italy's rate of new COVID-19 infections and hospitalizations has been gradually declining in recent weeks, but the death toll remains stubbornly high, with between 300 and 450 fatalities on most days.
And finally on the program, are you upset with an ex-partner? Well, this might be for you. A zoo in the southeast of England is giving scorned lovers the chance to name a cockroach after an ex with their Name a Cockroach program. Hemsley Conservation Centre in Fairseat is home to a colony of approximately 12 adult Madagascar hissing cockroaches and some hundreds of babies, which for £1.50 donation can be named to fund conservation projects at the zoo. Donors will receive a certificate with the option of adding a personalised message, and their chosen name will appear on a roach board, which will be revealed on Valentine's Day.
For Valentine's Day, you can name a cockroach after an ex-partner. If you've had a particularly nasty breakup and need a pick-me-up, it's a good way to have a little giggle to yourself or with your friends. But also, we're saying if you wanted a name after a politician maybe this year, then you're more than welcome to. All names are welcome. And it's all to raise money for projects that we're doing here at the zoo and helping us care for all the animals here. And then you can put in the names, which will then be put on the roach board here on Valentine's Day, or you can leave it anonymous, and then you get a certificate at the end, which you can put in your own message or leave a message for a friend as something to remember what you've done.
Well, we've warned you, don't be surprised if you see you're named after a cockroach. And that's the programme today. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Tenny Ola Shibowale. Have a lovely weekend.